The stranger arrived bleeding just before dawn, swaying in the saddle while smoke rose from the eastern edge of Ruth Calder's ranch. Her hay barn was burning, her cattle had broken through a cut fence, and 3 sets of hoofprints disappeared north toward the property of the man who had spent 2 years trying to buy her land. Ruth had survived those 2 years without her husband. By allowing the wounded stranger through her gate, she unknowingly gave shelter to the only witness who could reveal how Samuel Calder had died, and the next man marked for death. The fire awakened her before the gunshot did. Ruth came out of the ranch house carrying Samuel's old rifle in one hand and a dented brass lantern in the other. The Montana wind drove sparks across the yard. Beyond the blazing barn, nearly 60 cattle were scattering through a gap in the eastern fence. Then a gray horse staggered through the open gate. Its rider leaned over the animal's neck, one arm hanging loose. Blood had soaked the back of his coat. He tried to speak, but a rifle cracked somewhere beyond the pasture. The bullet struck the gatepost inches from Ruth's shoulder. She extinguished the lantern and fired toward the distant muzzle flash. She did not expect to hit anyone in the darkness. She merely wanted the hidden gunman to understand that Samuel Calder's widow was armed, awake, and in a very poor mood. The stranger slid from his saddle. Ruth dragged him behind the stone watering trough. He was perhaps 35, with dust-darkened hair and the lean face of a man who had spent too many nights outdoors. A bullet had passed through his left side. He carried a revolver, but when Ruth took it from his holster, he made no effort to stop her. "How many are coming?" she demanded. "3. Who are they?" His eyes drifted toward the northern hills. "Men who don't want me talking." Another shot struck the trough. Ruth fired back, then seized the reins of his horse. "If you can stand, do it now." Together they stumbled toward the ranch house, while flames consumed the barn behind them. Ruth's foreman had abandoned the ranch a week earlier after receiving an anonymous threat. That left only Ruth and 14-year-old Noah Pike, the orphaned stable boy sleeping in the bunkhouse. She shouted for Noah to release the remaining horses and drive them toward the western pasture. The boy obeyed without argument. Frontier children learned early that questions could wait until after the shooting stopped. Inside the house, Ruth laid the stranger across the kitchen table and cut open his coat. A folded sheet of paper slipped from an inner pocket. At its top was a rough map of the Calder ranch. The barn, the eastern fence, and the dry creek bed were carefully marked. Beneath them appeared a 4th mark, a black cross drawn over Samuel's grave. Ruth pressed the rifle against the stranger's chest. "Who made this?" His face tightened as she removed a blood-soaked strip of cloth from his wound. "My name is Elias Boone," he said. "I worked for Grant Voss. Voss owned the neighboring ranch. He had offered to buy Ruth's land 3 times since Samuel's death. When persuasion failed, cattle disappeared, water channels mysteriously collapsed, and reliable workers received threats." Ruth's finger settled against the trigger. "Then I should leave you outside for your friends." "They're not my friends. Why is my husband's grave marked on your map?" Elias looked directly at her. "Because Grant Voss sent those men to burn your barn, drive off your herd, and bury me beside Samuel." The color drained from Ruth's face. Elias caught her wrist before she could step away. "Your husband didn't drown in Cottonwood Creek, Mrs. Calder." His voice weakened to a whisper. "I was there the night he died." For one terrible moment, Ruth heard nothing except the fire devouring the barn roof. Then Noah shouted from the yard that the last horses were clear, and the world began moving again. Ruth pulled her wrist from Elias's hand and pressed a folded towel against his wound. "If you are lying to me, Mr. Boone, dying will be the easiest part of your morning." Elias managed a grim nod. "That seems fair." Ruth left him on the kitchen table and ran outside. The eastern barn could not be saved, but the stone-walled equipment shed stood less than 20 feet away. If its roof caught fire, she would lose her plows, harnesses, and winter feed cutter. She and Noah formed a desperate 2-person line between the well and the shed, carrying buckets until their arms shook. Ruth used Samuel's dented brass lantern to smash burning shingles from the roof whenever sparks landed there. By sunrise, the hay barn had collapsed into a smoking skeleton, but the equipment shed and ranch house remained standing. The three riders did not return. Their tracks, clearly visible in the morning light, led north before separating along a rocky ridge. Ruth noticed that one horse wore a shoe with a triangular notch missing from the right hind heel. She knelt and measured the print against the width of her palm. "You think they came from Voss's ranch?" Noah asked. "I think tracks are more honest than men," she answered. "Cover this one with an empty feed barrel. Nobody steps near it." Inside the house, Elias was conscious but pale. Ruth heated a knife over the stove, cleaned the wound, and discovered that the bullet had passed through without striking bone. He watched her work without complaint, though sweat gathered along his forehead. "Tell me what happened to Samuel." Elias stared at the ceiling. 2 years ago, I kept cattle records for Grant Voss. Your husband discovered Voss was altering brands and selling animals taken from smaller ranches. Samuel copied several pages from Voss's ledger. He planned to take them to the territorial marshal in Helena. Ruth remembered that week. Samuel had told her he was riding to Cottonwood Creek to inspect a washed-out fence. He had kissed her at the door and promised to return before supper. "Voss learned what he had done," Elias continued. "He sent 2 men after him. I followed because I thought I could warn Samuel before they reached the creek." "But you failed." "Yes." The blunt admission struck harder than an excuse would have. Elias explained that he had watched from the trees as Voss's men pulled Samuel from his horse. They demanded the copied records, but Samuel refused to tell them where he had hidden the pages. During the struggle, one man struck him with a rifle stock. They placed his body in the flooded creek and arranged the scene to resemble an accident. "You witnessed murder and remained silent for 2 years. I was a coward for most of the first year," Elias said. "During the second, I was trying to become something else." He told her he had quietly followed Voss's cattle shipments, collecting sale receipts and copied brand registrations. 3 nights earlier, he had stolen the map from Voss's office. Voss believed Samuel had buried the missing ledger pages somewhere on the Calder ranch. The marked grave was only one of several places his men intended to search. Ruth unfolded the map again. The cross over Samuel's grave was not the only mark she now noticed. A faint circle had been drawn around the equipment shed, the same building she had just saved from the fire. Elias struggled upright. If Samuel's evidence is still here, Voss will come back. Ruth placed his revolver on the table, just beyond his reach. "Then you will stay alive long enough to help me find it. You trust me?" "No." Ruth picked up the dented lantern. Its brass frame was blackened, but the glass had not broken. "But I believe Grant Voss wants us both dead. For now, that will have to serve." Ruth waited until Noah had driven the scattered cattle into the western pasture before beginning the search. She told the boy only that Elias had been attacked by rustlers and that Grant Voss might send men to inspect the damage. Noah was young, but not foolish. He glanced at the blood on the kitchen floor, then at the rifle beside Ruth's chair, and understood that the truth was worse than the explanation. Elias could barely stand, so Ruth ordered him to remain inside while she searched the equipment shed. He ignored her within 10 minutes and appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed against his bandaged side. "If you tear that wound open," she said, "I will stitch it closed with harness thread." "I believe you would." The shed smelled of smoke, leather, and damp soil. Ruth inspected every board Samuel had replaced during the final months of his life. She emptied nail boxes, opened tool chests, and removed the wooden handles from 2 shovels. Elias examined the walls and floor with slower, more deliberate attention. He tapped each stone near the foundation and studied the dust beneath the workbench, looking for places that had been disturbed before the fire. They found nothing. After nearly 2 hours, Ruth's patience gave way. He may not have hidden the papers here at all. Voss could have marked this building because he intended to burn it. "Possible," Elias said. "But Samuel knew men were following him. He would have chosen something ordinary, something you could keep without realizing its value." Ruth looked around the shed. Most of Samuel's possessions had remained exactly where he left them. His saddle, a broken spur, 2 pairs of gloves, and the brass lantern Ruth had carried during the fire. Elias picked it up. One side had been dented where Ruth struck the burning shingles. The fuel chamber should have been nearly empty, yet the lantern felt unusually heavy. "Samuel repaired the base shortly before he died," Ruth said. I remember because I told him to buy a new one. He said there was no sense throwing away a thing that could still be made useful. Using the tip of his knife, Elias loosened a thin metal plate beneath the fuel chamber. Behind it lay a packet wrapped in oilskin. Ruth's hands began trembling before she touched it. Inside were 3 copied ledger pages bearing columns of brands, cattle numbers, and railroad freight car registrations. Several entries were marked with the initials GV. Beside them, Samuel had written the names of 4 ranchers who had reported missing cattle. One of those men had lost nearly his entire herd and left Montana the previous winter. The pages proved that Samuel had discovered the theft, but they did not prove who had ordered his death. Worse, the final page ended halfway through an entry. Elias turned the oilskin wrapper over. Written along its inner edge were 6 words in Samuel's hand. "Where iron drinks when the sun stands highest." "The water pump," Ruth said immediately. "At noon its shadow falls directly beneath the iron trough." Elias folded the pages carefully. "If the remaining evidence is buried there, we should wait until dark. This is my land. I will not creep across it as though I am the criminal. And if Voss has someone watching the ranch, then creeping will only make us easier to mistake for prey." It was the first serious disagreement between them. Elias wanted patience, secrecy, and time to study their enemy. Ruth had endured 2 years of being pushed backward one fence post at a time. Waiting felt too much like surrender. Before either could continue, Noah rushed into the shed. "Mrs. Calder, riders are coming." Ruth stepped outside. Grant Voss approached through the open gate with 2 ranch hands beside him. One of their horses left an uneven print in the soft ground. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the triangular notch missing from its right hind shoe. She handed Samuel's copied pages to Elias. "Hide these." "What are you going to do?" Ruth lifted her rifle and walked toward the yard. "I am going to ask our concerned neighbor why his horse was standing beside my burning barn before dawn." Grant Voss rode into the yard as though he had been invited. He was a broad man in his early 50s, dressed in a dark wool coat too fine for morning ranch work. His silver hair remained neatly combed, despite the wind, and his expression carried the measured concern of a man who preferred cruelty to arrive wearing good manners. The 2 riders beside him were less polished. One was a narrow-faced ranch hand Ruth knew as Silas Burke. The other, Amos Clay, sat upon the horse with the damaged hind shoe. Voss looked past Ruth toward the ruins. "Terrible business. I saw the smoke from my northern pasture and came as soon as I could." "That must have been convenient," Ruth replied. "Your men were already halfway here." Clay shifted in his saddle. The movement caused his horse to step into the soft ground, leaving another print with the same triangular gap Ruth had found beside the burned barn. Voss followed her gaze. "Something troubling you?" 3 riders attacked this ranch before dawn. One of their horses wore a broken shoe exactly like that one. Clay's hand moved toward his coat. Burke glanced at him sharply, but Voss remained calm. "Half the horses in Montana are missing a nail or a piece of iron by autumn. You cannot accuse a man of arson because his animal needs a blacksmith. I haven't accused anyone yet." "No, but you are standing with a rifle. I have found that men answer a widow's questions more carefully when she carries one." Voss smiled, though no warmth reached his eyes. He offered to send workers to repair her fence and help recover the remaining cattle. Ruth refused. He then mentioned that rebuilding the barn would be expensive and reminded her that his previous offer for the Calder ranch remained available. He spoke gently, almost sympathetically, as if purchasing her land would be an act of charity, rather than the goal of his campaign. "You have lost your husband, your foreman, and now your winter hay," he said. "There is no shame in admitting that one person cannot carry all of this." Ruth stepped closer to Clay's horse and studied the dried mud on its legs. Beneath the dark soil clung pale yellow clay found only around the eastern creek bed beside her barn. "I have not yet discovered what one person can carry," she said, "but I know exactly how much interference she can survive." The ranch house door opened behind her. Elias emerged slowly, wearing a clean shirt Ruth had found among Samuel's old clothes. His face was colorless, but his coat concealed the bandage around his side. For the first time, Voss's composure changed. It lasted less than a second, a tightening around his mouth, a brief widening of the eyes, but Ruth saw it. So did Elias. Voss recovered quickly. "You appear to have acquired a new employee. He is passing through. Is that so?" Voss looked directly at Elias. "You have the face of a man I may have met before." "I have one of those faces," Elias answered. Burke stared at Elias with undisguised recognition. His right hand drifted toward his revolver. Ruth raised her rifle before his fingers reached the grip. "Take your hand away from your weapon, Mr. Burke." Silence settled over the yard. Noah watched from behind the bunkhouse, holding Samuel's old shotgun. Voss finally turned his horse. "You have had a difficult morning, Mrs. Calder. Grief can make ordinary events appear connected. I advise you not to make accusations you cannot prove." Ruth looked at the hoofprints leading from the burned barn to Clay's horse. "That is excellent advice. You should give it to your men before the sheriff begins asking questions." Voss and his riders left through the gate. Ruth waited until they disappeared over the northern ridge before lowering her rifle. Elias gripped the porch railing, his strength nearly exhausted. "You were right about the horse," he said, "but Voss will replace that shoe before sunset. Not before Noah rides to town and brings Sheriff Bell here. The sheriff will not arrest Clay for owning a limping horse." "No, but I want the attack recorded. Men like Voss depend upon every crime appearing separate from the one before it." Elias studied her with new respect. She was not acting from anger alone. She was beginning to build a pattern exactly as an investigator would. Then his attention returned to the ridge where Voss had vanished. "The man on his left was Silas Burke," Elias said quietly. "He was beside Cottonwood Creek 2 years ago." Ruth turned toward him. Elias's voice hardened. "He is the man who struck Samuel." Sheriff Thomas Bell arrived shortly after midday, with Noah riding beside him. By then, the fire had burned itself down to a bed of smoking timber. Ruth showed him the cut fence, the bullet lodged in the gatepost, and the protected hoofprint beneath the feed barrel. Bell examined each carefully, then removed his hat and rubbed a tired hand over his thinning hair. "The print resembles Clay's horse," he admitted, "but resemblance is not proof he rode it here. The Yellow Creek clay on its legs came from my eastern pasture. It also exists along 3 miles of the same creek." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Will you question him?" "I will question all 3 men. That is what the law permits me to do." Elias watched from the porch without speaking. Bell noticed him, but accepted Ruth's explanation that he was an injured traveler. Whether the sheriff believed it hardly mattered. He recorded the attack in his notebook, removed the bullet from the gatepost, and promised to examine Clay's horse before leaving town. They both knew Voss would have changed the damaged shoe by then. After Bell departed, the shadow of the iron water pump shortened across the yard. Ruth carried Samuel's lantern, while Elias leaned upon a shovel. At noon, the pump's shadow fell directly beneath the long cattle trough. Ruth knelt and found one of the supporting stones had been set in soil rather than mortar. Together, they moved the empty trough aside. Elias dug despite Ruth's objections, stopping twice when pain seized his wounded side. 6 inches below the surface, the shovel struck metal. The buried tin box contained the missing ledger pages, 3 freight receipts, and a letter Samuel had written to the territorial marshal but never mailed. In it, he named Voss as the organizer of the cattle thefts and identified Silas Burke and Amos Clay as the men who altered the brands. The records could ruin Voss's operation. They still could not prove he had ordered Samuel's murder. Ruth sat on the ground with the letter in her hands. For 2 years, she had imagined Samuel alone beside the flooded creek, losing his footing and calling for help no one could give. Now she knew he had died because he had refused to surrender evidence that could protect his neighbors. "He should have told me," she whispered. "He may have believed silence would protect you. It did not. It only left me fighting an enemy I could not see." Elias understood that accusation was meant for both dead and living men. "I should have come to you sooner." "Yes. I thought Voss would leave you alone once he had the pages. He wanted the land before Samuel found the ledger. The evidence merely gave him another reason." Elias sat beside her, leaving enough distance that she did not feel crowded. He did not ask forgiveness or reach for her hand. He simply remained there while she read Samuel's final letter a second time. As evening approached, Elias repaired the lantern's loosened base with a strip of copper. When he finished, its small flame burned steadily behind the smoke-darkened glass. Ruth placed the evidence inside a flour tin and concealed it beneath a loose board in the kitchen. Tomorrow we take copies to Helena. Elias looked toward the northern ridge. Voss will be watching every road. Then we do not use the road. For the first time since entering her ranch, Elias smiled. Ruth picked up the lantern. Do not mistake good planning for forgiveness, Mr. Boone. I wouldn't dare. Ruth and Elias worked through the night, making 2 exact copies of Samuel's evidence. Ruth knew every brand used within 50 miles and identified 3 altered marks that Elias had assumed were merely poor drawings. Elias arranged the receipts by date, matched them to railroad car numbers, and wrote a sworn account of what he had witnessed at Cottonwood Creek. They sealed the originals inside oilskin and hid them beneath the brass lantern's removable base. 1 copy went inside Elias's coat. Ruth concealed the second beneath the lining of her saddle. Before sunrise, they left Noah in charge of the ranch and rode west instead of south. The ordinary road to Alder Junction crossed open country where Voss's men could see them for miles. Ruth chose an abandoned cattle trail that followed a dry ravine through the hills. You have been planning this route for some time, Elias observed. Since Voss began watching my road. You never intended to surrender the ranch. I considered it once. What stopped you? I imagined him sitting in my kitchen. Elias decided that was the most convincing defense of private property he had ever heard. 2 miles from the junction, he noticed 3 ravens repeatedly lifting from the same patch of cottonwoods. Birds did not behave that way around empty trees. He signaled Ruth to stop. Through the branches ahead, sunlight flashed against a rifle barrel. They left their horses in the ravine and continued on foot until they reached an irrigation ditch running behind the stage station. Ruth knew where the ditch narrowed beneath a wooden footbridge. Elias knew how to move without showing his outline above the bank. Between her knowledge of the land and his habit of noticing danger, they entered Alder Junction unseen. The station clerk, Mrs. Agnes Talbot, had known Ruth for 12 years. She placed the original packet inside the locked mail case bound for Helena and signed a receipt confirming its departure. Elias then sent a telegram to the territorial marshal, stating that evidence concerning organized cattle theft and the murder of Samuel Calder was on its way. The mail coach leaves in 8 minutes, Agnes said. If anyone wants that packet, they will have to stop a federal carrier in the middle of town. Outside, 2 of Voss's riders searched the main road while the coach departed through the northern entrance. They never noticed Ruth and Elias watching from behind the freight office. By the time they returned to the Calder ranch, Elias's bandage was red again. Ruth helped him dismount without mentioning it. Their shoulders touched briefly, and neither moved away at once. Noah emerged from the house, carrying an official notice that had been nailed to the door. A bank in Helena claimed Samuel had used the ranch as security for an unpaid $5,000 loan 6 months before his death. Unless Ruth produced payment or disproved the document within 10 days, the Calder ranch would be seized and offered for sale. Attached was a copy of the agreement. Ruth studied Samuel's supposed signature. It resembled his handwriting closely enough to deceive a stranger, but the date exposed the lie. Samuel could not have signed this, she said. He was in Wyoming buying breeding stock that entire month. Can you prove it? His hotel receipts and livestock contracts are in the ranch safe. They entered the house and found the safe open. The receipts were gone. On the kitchen table, where the flour tin had been hidden, lay the triangular piece missing from Amos Clay's horseshoe. Voss no longer intended to frighten her away. He intended to erase every means she had of remaining. Elias examined the forged agreement, while Ruth searched the house for anything the intruders had overlooked. Whoever opened the safe had taken Samuel's hotel receipts and livestock contracts, but they had ignored Ruth's ranch journal. On the date Samuel supposedly signed the loan in Helena, she had recorded sending him money through a bank in Cheyenne. The transfer would have required Samuel to identify himself in person. If that bank still has its transaction book, it proves he was hundreds of miles from Helena, Elias said. Then we ask them for a certified copy. And we find the notary who witnessed this signature. Ruth pointed to the name beneath the seal, Milton Reeve. He keeps Voss's accounts. The forgery had been designed to appear respectable while remaining entirely within Voss's control. Elias prepared 2 telegrams, one to the Cheyenne Bank and another to the territorial marshal. Noah rode them to Alder Junction by the Western Trail. After the boy left, Elias packed his saddlebag. Ruth watched from the doorway. "Where are you going?" "To Helena. If I testify publicly, Voss cannot keep pretending Samuel's death was an accident. He will direct his attention toward me instead of you." "You mean you intend to run again, only this time you have found a noble explanation." His hands stopped. "I am trying to keep you alive. Samuel tried to protect me with silence. You tried to protect me by remaining silent for 2 years. Both decisions left me alone with the consequences." Elias looked toward the burned barn. "Men have died because they stood beside me. And my husband died because good men kept stepping aside." The words wounded him, but Ruth did not withdraw them. She crossed the room and removed his saddlebag from the table. "If you leave because you are afraid, say so honestly. If you stay as my partner in this fight. No more choosing danger on my behalf and calling it protection." Elias was silent for a long moment. "Your partner?" "Until Voss is defeated." He almost smiled. "A very limited arrangement. For now." Ruth extended her hand. Elias took it carefully. It was not a declaration of love, nor even complete forgiveness. It was something more useful at that moment, a promise that neither would make the next decision alone. Near sunset, Noah returned safely with receipts confirming both telegrams had been sent. He also brought news that Voss had ordered enough lumber to build new cattle pens beside the proposed railroad loading ground. The planned pens stood on the northern section of Ruth's property. "He expects to own the ranch within 10 days, Elias said. Darkness settled over the valley. Ruth lit Samuel's repaired lantern and hung it beside the kitchen window while they studied the map. Less than an hour later, a rifle shot shattered the glass. Elias pulled Ruth to the floor as a second bullet struck the wall. Outside, cattle began bawling in the western pasture. Noah rushed in from the bunkhouse. Someone opened the ravine gate. Ruth reached for her rifle, but Elias caught sight of movement near the equipment shed. "The cattle are a distraction," he said. "They want us to ride west while someone searches the ranch." A shadow slipped toward the house. Ruth extinguished the lantern. "Then let us make certain he finds more than he expected." Ruth relit the brass lantern and placed it behind the kitchen curtain. From outside, its glow cast a human-shaped shadow across the wall. Elias left an empty oilskin packet on the table, then concealed himself beside the pantry door. Ruth whispered to Noah to slip through the rear window and ride for Sheriff Bell by way of the dry creek bed. The shadow outside reached the porch. Silas Burke entered quietly, revolver drawn. He saw the packet and crossed the kitchen without noticing Elias behind him. The instant Burke touched it, Elias pressed a gun against his back. "Samuel turned around before you struck him," Elias said. "I remember his face. I also remember yours." Burke froze, then drove his elbow into Elias's wounded side. Elias collapsed against the table. Burke raised his revolver, but before he could fire, Ruth stepped from the hallway with Samuel's rifle aimed at his chest. "Drop it." A shot came through the window. It struck the lantern, knocking it from the sill. Elias caught it before it hit the floor, though the hot metal burned his palm. Outside, a rider galloped toward the western pasture. "Clay," Elias gasped. Ruth left Burke to him and ran for the barn horse. The cattle were already being driven toward the ravine, where a drop concealed by darkness could kill half the herd. Ruth did not follow the rider directly. She entered the irrigation ditch and used its high bank to circle ahead unseen. Amos Clay reached the ravine gate and turned to fire toward the house again. Ruth rose from the ditch 20 yards behind him. "Throw down the rifle." Clay wheeled his horse, but Ruth fired into the ground beside its front hooves. The animal reared, throwing him into the grass. Before he recovered, Ruth had his own rifle pointed at him. Meanwhile, Elias bound Burke's hands with a curtain cord. His wound had reopened, but he remained standing. Burke stared at the empty packet on the table and understood that Voss had sent him to risk the gallows for nothing. "He told us the evidence was still here," Burke muttered. "Voss has been wrong about Ruth Calder from the beginning," Elias said. Sheriff Bell arrived before midnight with Noah and 2 deputies. He arrested Burke and Clay for armed assault, attempted theft and destruction of property. The damaged horseshoe, the matching prints and the bullets recovered from Ruth's gate and wall connected them directly to both attacks. At first, both men refused to speak. Then Bell separated them. Clay claimed Burke had set the barn fire. Burke learned that Clay had blamed him and demanded paper. He confessed to stealing the ranch documents, altering brands for Voss, and helping stage Samuel's death. He also identified Milton Reeve as the man who forged the loan agreement. The confession was not noble. It was the frightened work of a guilty man discovering that loyalty among criminals lasted only until the first locked door. It was useful nevertheless. Just before dawn, a telegraph messenger reached the ranch. The territorial marshal had examined Samuel's evidence and issued warrants for Voss and Reeve. The Cheyenne Bank had also confirmed that Samuel personally collected Ruth's transfer on the day of the supposed loan signing. But Voss had already abandoned his ranch. Sheriff Bell unfolded a second message. A station agent saw him boarding the eastbound freight at Alder Junction. Elias looked at the freight schedule written on Samuel's copied ledger pages. The train had to slow at Calder Crossing, where the track curved above the river. "He is not escaping," Elias said. "He is going after the mail coach connection. Voss knows the original evidence will change trains at the crossing." Ruth lifted the battered lantern. Its glass was cracked, but the flame still burned. "Then we reach it first." Calder Crossing lay 4 miles east of the ranch, but the public road curved twice that distance around the river. Ruth knew a cattle path running directly across the southern ridge. She and Elias reached the crossing minutes before the eastbound freight emerged from the hills. The small station appeared deserted. Its agent, Henry Cole, lay behind the ticket counter with blood running from a cut above his ear. He was alive, but the locked mail case had been forced open. Voss took the Helena packet, Cole said. He went toward the bridge. The freight train slowed for the crossing. Voss had jumped from it before the final car reached the platform, and now stood halfway across the wooden railroad bridge, holding Samuel's evidence above the river. The water below ran deep and fast between the rocks. Elias stepped onto the tracks. "Keep Ruth here," he told Cole. Ruth heard him and ignored the instruction. Voss drew his revolver. "You should have continued running, Boone." "I did that for 2 years. It never improved me." "You think those papers will hang me? Samuel Calder tried the same thing, and you killed him for it. I gave him a chance to surrender them. He chose his land over his life." Ruth heard every word from behind the station wall. So did Henry Cole. In the distance, a whistle announced the approaching Helena mail train. Ruth looked at the cracked brass lantern in her hand and remembered how Samuel had once stopped a cattle train by swinging a red light beside the track. She tore a strip from her red wool scarf, wrapped it around the lantern glass, and placed it in the center of the rails. Then she swung the light in a wide warning arc. The engineer answered with 3 urgent blasts. Brakes screamed as the train slowed. Voss looked toward it, realizing that passengers, railroad workers, and an armed postal guard would reach the crossing within moments. That brief distraction was enough. Elias advanced, but Voss fired. The bullet grazed Elias's shoulder and spun him sideways. Ruth emerged from behind the station and aimed Samuel's rifle. "Drop the revolver, Grant." Voss seized Elias by the coat and pressed the gun beneath his jaw. "Put down the rifle, or he dies." 2 years earlier, Ruth had lost Samuel because men had decided what dangers she should be permitted to face. She would not allow Elias to repeat the same mistake by offering his life in exchange for hers. She did not lower the weapon. "You cannot escape across the bridge," she said. "The postal guard is behind you. Sheriff Bell is coming from the west. Burke has confessed. Reeve forged the loan and the Cheyenne Bank disproved it. Destroying those papers changes nothing." For the first time, Voss understood that the packet in his hand was no longer the only evidence against him. His grip loosened. Elias struck his injured arm away and drove him against the bridge railing. The revolver fell between the ties into the river. Voss reached for the packet, but Ruth stepped onto the bridge and took it first. The postal guard restrained him until Sheriff Bell arrived. As Bell led Voss away, Ruth turned to Elias. Blood darkened his sleeve. though the wound was shallow. He looked toward the open country beyond the tracks, as if some part of him still expected to leave before his presence brought another danger to her door. "The case is finished," he said. "You no longer need me." Ruth placed the battered lantern between them. "I did not ask you to remain because I needed another hired hand." "What are you asking?" She took his uninjured hand. "Ride back through my gate, Elias. This time, come home." The evidence reached Helena the following morning under armed protection. Grant Voss was charged with organizing cattle theft, forging financial documents, destroying property, and conspiring in Samuel Calder's murder. Milton Reeve was arrested 2 days later after investigators found Voss's payment records hidden inside his accounting office. Burke's confession, Elias's eyewitness testimony, and Samuel's ledger established the full chain of events. Amos Clay eventually admitted helping Burke place Samuel's body in Cottonwood Creek. Neither man received the leniency he expected. The forged loan was declared invalid. The bank withdrew its claim against the Calder Ranch, and a territorial court ordered Voss's remaining property sold to compensate the ranchers whose cattle he had stolen. Ruth used her portion of the settlement to rebuild the hay barn, replace the winter feed, and purchase the northern pasture Voss had once planned to seize from her. She did not need Elias to save the ranch for her. She needed him to stand beside her while she saved it herself. Elias remained through the winter. At first, he slept in the bunkhouse and insisted upon accepting ordinary ranch wages. Ruth allowed this arrangement for 6 weeks before informing him that no ordinary hired hand reorganized freight records after supper or argued with the owner about breeding stock over breakfast. By spring, he had stopped looking toward the road whenever an unfamiliar rider appeared. He still carried caution with him, but it no longer controlled where he slept or whom he permitted himself to love. Ruth and Elias married 1 year after the night he rode wounded through her gate. Noah stood beside them during the small ceremony in the rebuilt barn. Samuel's name remained on the ranch records, not because Ruth was trapped in grief, but because a new life did not require her to erase the one that had come before it. Elias understood that without ever needing it explained. Together, they turned the Calder Ranch into one of the most reliable cattle operations in the valley. Ruth managed the herds and land. Elias handled contracts, freight records, and disputes. Noah eventually became their foreman and later purchased a neighboring parcel of his own. The brass lantern remained above the kitchen window for many years. Its frame was dented, its glass bore a thin crack, and the base concealed no further secrets. Elias offered several times to replace it. Ruth always refused. "That light stopped a train," she reminded him. "It was also shot, dropped, and nearly burned the house down. Then, it belongs in this family." 32 years after Elias first passed through the gate, they hung the lantern on the porch while their grandchildren gathered inside for supper. By then, the ranch had survived droughts, blizzards, and one memorable bull that developed a personal hatred of laundry. The light still burned steadily through its cracked glass. Elias had once believed that remaining beside someone only gave danger another person to take from him. Ruth taught him the opposite. Sometimes leaving was the greater loss. And Ruth, who had defended the frontier ranch alone after her husband died, discovered that accepting a partner did not make her less capable. It simply meant she no longer had to carry every burden without a hand beside hers, which required greater courage, Ruth refusing to surrender her land, or Elias finally choosing to stop running. In the next story, a rancher orders a quiet mail-order bride, only to discover that the woman stepping from the train is carrying a rifle, a wounded child, and the deed to land someone is willing to kill for.